Chapter 12. When Papa came home from work on December 11th, Mom and Joaquin jumped on him as soon as he came into the hall and immediately started to talk about the girl who had disappeared. "Have you found out what her name was?" "Let me in first," said Papa. "Yes, she was called Elizabeth Hanson, in fact. It happened in December of 1948. I went into the bookshop as well. I went into the storeroom with the bookseller. Why? And there he found the photo that the flower seller had once put in the window in exchange for a glass of water. I have it in my briefcase." Papa put the picture on the table. Joaquin snatched it, and Mama leaned in for a look. It showed a young woman with long, fair hair. Around her neck she was wearing a silver cross set with a red stone. At the bottom was written, Elizabeth. No last name. It's not exactly an unusual name, but it's in Norwegian, and in many countries Elizabeth is spelled differently. Mama looked at him. "So you don't think she's Norwegian?" "Well, I've no idea, but look at the photo. The dome in the background is St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. She's standing on the street that leads to St. Peter's Square. The car dates from the end of the 1950s. "I feel almost scared," whispered Mama. "What are we getting mixed up in?" Papa put his elbows on the table. "It's a mystery. But there's no reason to believe that the girl who disappeared in 1948 is the woman in the photograph. He was staring in front of him. He wasn't at the market." "Who? Now you're talking in riddles." "The flower seller, John, the man with the glass of water. I'd give a lot to talk to him. There's one thing we can take for granted. He made this strange calendar, and now he's disappeared." Joaquin was thinking about everything so much that he wanted to go to bed early. Then it wouldn't be so long before morning again, and he'd get to know more about Elizabeth Hanson and the angel Ethereal. When he woke up on December 12th, Mama and Papa were in his room before he had opened his eyes. That was unusual because it was Saturday, and Joaquin usually was up before everybody else. "You're the one who opens the calendar, Joaquin," said Papa. It was obvious that he would have liked to open it himself. The picture was of a man in a red tunic. He was holding a large sign. Mama and Papa sat on the bed. Joaquin began to read the paper that had fallen out. Quirinius. The 5 sheep had crossed a ridge and were running down into fertile farmland. Imperial fluttered around the little flock, and after the sheep and the cherub came Jacob and Joshua, Caspar and Balthazar, Ephriel and Elizabeth. They passed Lake Bael, and then several more lakes. The biggest and most beautiful was Lake Geneva. It glittered so much that it looked as if a piece of heaven had fallen down on the earth. Only when Elizabeth looked up and saw that there was no hole in the sky was she certain that the picture of the sky in the lake was only a reflection. Again they followed an old road alongside a river in a deep valley. Ephriel told them that the river was called the Rhone, and that all the water it carried with it from the Alps ran down first into the Lake of Geneva and later into the Mediterranean Sea. They ran across an old bridge to the other side of the river and stopped in front of a monastery called St. Maurice. There were high Alps on every side with snow on their peaks. The time is 1079 years after Christ. The monks have lived here among these tall mountains, praising God and his creation ever since the 7th century. The monastery is built above around the grave of the holy St. Maurice, who was killed here in this valley in the year 285 because he refused to get to worship Roman gods. He had just finished speaking when a monk walked out of the monastery. He greeted them with a silent nod, Gloria Dei. "And the same to you," said Elizabeth, even though she had not understood what the monk was saying. Only then did the monk notice the angels. He knelt on the grass and said, "Alleluia, Alleluia." Clearly they weren't used to angels visiting the monastery, though it was so high up in the Alps that it was almost the nearest neighbor to the angels in heaven. Imperial rose half a meter off the ground, flew towards the monk. "Fear not, and be in no wise afraid. We're only going on a short journey to Bethlehem to greet the Christ child." Then King Caspar of Nubia strode up to the monk. "Peace be with you and your monastery. As the angel has said, we are on our way to the Holy Land to pay homage to the King of Kings in Bethlehem, the city of David." With those words they set off again. They came to a little place called Martigny, where there was an old Roman theater. The Romans used to this route over the Alps too. Much later, Napoleon crossed the Alps with his army. The Romans used this... To Bethlehem, called Joshua. They sped up towards the high mountain. The air was so thin and so clear that Elizabeth had to ask herself if she was on the way to heaven. A few times they saw a mountain hare, a marmot, or an alpine goat. Up in the sky, crows and vultures circled, and now and again a grouse started up from the bushes. At the top of the mountain pass stood a large house. The year is 1045 after Christ. That house is a hospice. The monks who live here are to look after people who are crossing the Alps. It's brand new and is built by Bernard of Menton. At this time, and even in your time, Elizabeth, the Benedictine monks live up here and organize rescue missions for people who get lost. They are helped by their clever St. Bernard dogs. Right, said the cherub imperial, for Jesus wanted to teach humans to help one another when they were in distress. Once he told a story about a man who was on his way from Jerusalem to Jericho. He was attacked by robbers who left him half dead at the side of the road. Several priests passed by, but none of them bent down to help the man, who was in danger of losing his life. Jesus thought that there must be a point in their being priests if they could. Well, there wasn't much of a point in their being priests if they couldn't even be bothered to help a fellow human being in distress. They might just as well forget all their pious prayers. Elizabeth nodded, but then a Samaritan came along, and Samaritans weren't very popular in Judea. It was because they had a religion that was a little different from that of the Jews. But the Samaritan was compassionate and helped the unfortunate man so that he survived. Yes, indeed, but for there's no sense in believing what's right unless it leads to help people in distress. Elizabeth nodded again, and at one point where the path forked, a man was standing with a large sign in his hand. He was wearing a red tunic. On the side it said, written, "To Bethlehem," in capital letters. "A living road sign," said Elizabeth. Ephriel nodded. "Verily I say unto you, that road sign must be one of us." "Fear not, fear not, fear not," said Imperial. But the man with the sign was not in the least bit afraid. Nope, that wasn't quite correct. I mean, at your service, my friends. The very first thing I must remember to say is my name, because I too have been allowed to take part in this Advent calendar. My name is Quirinius, governor of Syria. Attractive appearance, closer acquaintance desired. Well, the most important thing, of course, is to be good and kind. Dixie! Elizabeth couldn't help stop laughing. He talked so oddly. It was as if there were two people talking at once, for he interrupted himself the whole time. He handed her the sign. He said, "And this, if I may have your attention, my friends, for here I have the icing on the cake. This prize is for you. Dixie!" "The sign is for me?" Elizabeth said. Quirinius replied, "Only the one side. I mean, you have to turn it around. You understand. Dixie!" Elizabeth didn't understand why he kept saying Dixie all the time. It sounded like the name of a dog or a cat. But the angel whispered that Dixie was Latin and meant that Quirinius had finished speaking. Elizabeth turned around the sign and saw to her great surprise that she was holding in her hand an Advent calendar with 24 doors. Covering all the doors was a picture of a young woman with fair hair. She was standing in front of a church with a large dome on top. The first 12. I mean, you may open the first 12 doors. We've come exactly that far on our journey. Dixie! She sat down on a rock. She opened the first door. Behind it was a picture of a lamb. The next an angel. The third a sheep. Then a shepherd, a sheep, a king of the Orient, a sheep, a shepherd, a sheep, a cherub, a king of the Orient. Elizabeth saw that these were the pictures of everyone who had joined the pilgrimage. But who was the woman? "Thank you very much," she said. Quirinius shook his head. "On the contrary, you're wrong about that. You don't need to say thank you. I do. I thank you and the others here for allowing an old Roman like myself to join this godly group, which is on the right way to Bethlehem. After all, it was not I, in fact, it was you, who set off after the delightful lamb. Dixie, Dixie, Dixie!" Elizabeth looked up at Ephriel and laughed. "But you haven't opened the 12th door." Elizabeth opened the 12th door, and now she was looking at a tiny picture of the same calendar she was holding. And here, too, there was a picture of a fair-haired woman in front of a dome. Joshua struck the shepherd's crook against a cairn and said, "To Bethlehem, to Bethlehem." "How far is it to Bethlehem?" said Elizabeth. "Not far now," said Ephriel. They sat looking at each other. Then Joaquin began to laugh. I hope Quirinius is going all the way to Bethlehem with them. Mama and Papa examined the piece of paper. He's brought the young woman in front of St. Peter's Square into the story of little Elizabeth. And then he's made a little advent calendar inside the big one. Do you think there's another advent calendar inside the little advent calendar? Said Joaquin. Who knows, said Mama. Who knows? Good night.